Boa noite.
Good evening to all. Good evening, Minister Paulo Guedes, and good evening, Mansueto. Today we will have a debate on the economic moment Brazil is crossing. And we have the privilege of having a debate between Mansueto, our partner and chief economist, with Minister Paulo Guedes. And this debate has occurred many times over the last 2 years, but most of them were privately held. Today, we will see Mansueto interviewing Paulo in an open fashion. So this is a privilege to all of us. So before passing the floor to Mansueto, I'd like to thank Minister Paulo Guedes for his presence, who has brought to Brazil an agenda of modernness in the last 2 years. It started before that. Mansueto was a part of this, and Mansueto and Paulo, together with other heroes who are still here, have brought winds of change and put Brazil on the right course. So we have turned to modernness, rationale, and society needs this. And sometimes these are deeper changes that require explanations that are broader, more detailed, and a bit of patience. But in the end, rationality always prevails. And this is why it's important to have chats like this in the open, in public, to have a clear agenda and explain its importance and motivation. So, Paulo, congratulations for your very modern agenda that you're bringing to Brazil, and congratulations for what has already happened. And let's root for a lot more to occur during this transformation process that is so positive for Brazil. Mansueto, good evening. Now the floor is yours, and a wonderful interview to the two of you. Thank you, André, and good evening to all our viewers. And I would like to especially thank Minister Paulo Guedes, who opened this space in his agenda to be with us and explain such a difficult agenda, all the reforms and all the changes that Brazil has faced. Minister Paulo, I would like to open by showing a speech that was very captivating. And you are a man of principles. You have many theses, and you are very convinced on these theses. Since the beginning of that speech, you highlighted that this country is spending too much, our tax burden is very high, and the business environment is very harmful to businesses, and we need to make a tax adjustment. And we have companies that sometimes they expect things from the government, and we have very hefty health programs, governmental programs, and the state spends on things that are not essential. And amidst all this, there's something that you have always highlighted. You have always respected the political class. Since your first day, you have always mentioned that I want to delegate the decision to the power of decision to the politicians. So this is very important. Sometimes people do not understand that we are in a country where public spending, and this year, it will be greater than 1,500,000,000,000 reais, and politicians will only be able to discuss the allocation of 100 billion reais. Of 1.5 trillion, politicians will only decide the allocation of 100 billion reais. This is too little. We want, as Brazilians, and this has always been the intention of the minister, to value the political class and return to Congress the allocation of expenditures. So these great theses you have always defended, Mr. Minister. And I would like to step back to 2019. Since your first day in office, you have always mentioned the following: I'm going to solve a problem that has been halted for 10 years, and also the onerous concession. This was something involving Petrobras and the federal government, and no one was able to work on this. And you were able to make progress in this. And in 2019, Paulo Guedes, as the Minister of Economy, the public deficit in Brazil was 61 billion reais. It was less than 1% of the GDP. And after 5 years, the public expenditures dropped. So, Mr. Guedes, can you please explain what happened in 2019? This agenda is based on very good ideas that you have to value the National Congress, the political system, and grant political decision power to the politicians, and also make the state concentrate on public health. And we also need to return to spending in a sustainable way. All these ideas that you have, Mr. Minister, they are against the government. Much to the contrary, I have followed a lot of your agenda, and your agenda is to recover the government in terms of what society expects from government and return to the private sector what they know how to do best. And investment should be in the hands of the public, of the private sector. In a little less than 2 years, in such a difficult period, it's worth highlighting that we have approved the new framework of basic sanitation and also the framework to reduce energy costs in Brazil. And we did a reform that was not able to be passed in 20 years, which was the in 2 years of government with a health crisis amidst it, and in a government that did not have a political basis. If we look at this great snapshot at the beginning of the government, we thought we would not be able to do this reform, but the country was able to do this. So what were we able to achieve, which was not little? And you fought very strongly, and you had to explain like a professor the need of this agenda for the country. Good evening, Mansueto, also André. It's always a privilege to be at this bank, a bank that I know for so long, and I have great admiration for you, Mansueto. We worked together in the start, and once I arrived, when I started talking to Mansueto, he said, Mansueto, I'm going to pass the office here, but I'm already thinking maybe down the road of leaving. And I asked Mansueto, stay with us, help us. You know the map of the mind. You're very good at this. Brazil needs you. Help us. And I can only thank you. Mansueto remained for a year and a half. He was going to stay 3-4 months, but he stayed a year and a half helping Brazil. So this was decisive in our beginnings. And I didn't know anyone, and I didn't know how things worked. And he was a fundamental component who helped us since the very start in this challenge. When we arrived, we had a very clear diagnosis. The state spends a lot poorly, and the main expenditures were growing rampantly, which were Social Security and the workload of the public government. So we attacked Social Security first, and the onerous concession was something that was halted for 7 years, and it was not giving us governability. And I am a convicted federalist. I think we have to govern where the people are. And when COVID arrived, we acted very quickly. And what we were going to do to transfer 300, 400 billion in 4 years, we did this in 8 months because we knew that we had to quickly decentralize the government and resources because the fight for public security, education, sanitation, and health is at the extreme end. In Brasilia, you think about the people, but we needed to do this in a decentralized way. So this first year, we advanced at great strides. We did the Social Security reform. This was sputtering for 20 years, but we never got off paper. We were growing 30, 50 billion every year, and it was the guarantee to maintain certain privileges. We were able to cut this, and now we have the public expenditures under control. Also, the interest on public indebtedness. I knew that the interest rates were extremely high. Even during the post-Real plan, we had a rate of 13% a year. So if you have over 13 years such high interest rates, this is really, really a burden on entrepreneurs. There's no productive capital that can multiply at such a rate. So we were really knocking down the entrepreneurship in Brazil, the very high interest rates, a very low uh, exchange rate. So we needed to attack this problem in two different fronts: flow and inventory. So we needed to change the fiscal policy and change the neutral interest rate. So if you are spending very quickly, which is what we did over the last 30, 40 years, you have an indebtedness that is a snowball at a very high interest rate to roll your debt, and you have you had an exchange rate, a foreign exchange rate of 1.8, 1.9. So you have two critical prices here that you need to change in the economy. So when you choose to change the mix and you pressure fiscal and you bring the interest rate down, in the flow dimension, you already start knocking down the interest rate. But I also knew that we wouldn't have time to change the prime and the basic surplus. So I couldn't just work in the flow dimension. I also needed to work in inventory. So we deleveraged the central bank. We sold some reserves. They sold 130 billion reais or something like that. BNDES sent 125 billion. Caixa Econômica also sent 20 billion. So we deleveraged public banks and made them pay for the debt because the prior government had leveraged the banks. In BNDES, they had injected 500 billion. So we made these public banks pay the debt that they had with the federal government, and we knocked the deficit from 2 to 1, around 65 billion, and we knocked public indebtedness and the relation with GDP to 74.5. We reviewed our expenditures and we lowered this 1% from 76.4 to 75.4. And we could have zeroed this debt if we hadn't thrown the onerous indebtedness to the states. We received a lot of support. We didn't have Parliament support. We were getting to Brasilia without support from Parliament. So we finally reached an agreement that everyone was playing together for Brazil. Even opposition joined forces with us because we had the promise of the onerous concession to states and cities. In the first year, we did the Social Security reform. One lubricated the other, and this made Congress work in our favor because they understood that we wanted to shrink and decentralize power. We trusted politics and decentralized politics. We needed intelligent economic decisions in a decentralized way, and also democracy. This is an algorithm of decentralizing power. These are independent powers. The federal government, they reinforce the governmental structures, and we came from a situation of the central government deciding everything. Instead of more government, we wanted more market economy, and within the government, rather than having more centralized decisions, we wanted to decentralize. Many people ask, where's the plan? Where's the plan? No, the plan is the Ministry of the Market. We can see Tarcísio in infrastructure, Marinho in the MDR. Their budgets are 8 billion, 9 billion. If they double this, it's 16 billion. So 8 billion more in investments. The private sector, over the last 6 months, they captured 60 billion. So the order of magnitude, the government can't make Brazil grow at a very fast pace. In 6 months, the private sector can invest a lot more and probably 10 times more than the government can. The public investment is 1.5% of the GDP. And if you double that, it's 3%. It's very little. It's not going to place Brazil on a sustainable growth track. In the internal front, during the first year, we had the Social Security reform and the onerous concession. Mercosur was at a standstill for 8 years. We made the European Union agreement. It was halted for 20 years since Doha. We did the WEFTA, the free trade agreement in Europe and in Central Europe and Switzerland and the northern countries. We had an understanding with Japan, Canada, South Korea. So we are advances at a fairly swift pace here. And we also did the economic freedom law to open up the economy, and we deleveraged public banks, and we placed what I consider the two subsequent reforms that were missing. One was the protocol to face the fiscal crisis. We had the Mansueto plan. We had the idea of creating the Republic Fiscal Council, and Mansueto would be the first president of this council. Brazil, with its hyperinflation in 89 and later in 94, before was 5,000%, the second one was 2,000%, we developed a culture of monetary instability. And we set goals, and we have a ritual that we have to, with the Copom, every 3 months or so. But on the fiscal side, it's the other thing. We already have the law of fiscal responsibility, and we don't have the culture. So states are facing difficulties, cities as well. The federal government faces difficulty. And this is interesting because the monetary culture we already had, and now we approve the independence of the central bank. So this is an institutional advancement that ratifies and consecrates and politicizes and depoliticizes the currency. Maybe it can help in the transition until the central bank is independent. No, we need to have at least 2 years to have an independent central bank and offshift this from the presidential elections. So we're in the middle of the government, the Bolsonaro government, and so we will have half term of Bolsonaro's government and the next and half of the upcoming term. So the currency is desynchronized, and this is important. This is a guarantee, and President Bolsonaro has fully supported this. This is very, very important. Previous governments, they were not this bold. They preferred to control the central banks, and this was not good for them nor for Brazil. It wasn't good for anybody. Who was able to reelect themselves selling $30-40 billion of reserves? They were not very popular. So this was not good for anyone. It was not good for those using economic stimulus to reelect themselves. It was not good for the central bank president at the time. So it wasn't good for anyone. And one of them was an excellent economist, very good. And he was a victim of this. He was politically used for the reelection, and then he was disposed of. And we had a currency rate fluctuation, and there was no fiscal support nor of the government to carry out their agenda. And he was removed, and the substitution was even worse. And everything exploded. And this was not virtuous. So this is an important institutional advancement, and it comes at a good time to prevent that transitory increases of certain sectors, supermarkets, civil construction, were transitory and sector-based, and the emergency bailout, and also the increase in commodity prices. So these sector and transitory hikes cannot become permanent, and the central bank exists to prevent these increases of becoming generalized. So we are able to move forward with the reforms. First, we did Social Security. Now we deleveraged public banks to change the mix of monetary policies and low interest rates, which opens a completely new front in Brazil. 1 million companies were created last year during the pandemic. During the 2015 recession, we lost 1.5 million jobs. And we also lost, after that, 1.3 million. So the GDP dropped 2.3%. Now it's going to drop 4.2. So an even greater drop, and we created 142 formal jobs. And we created 1 million new companies. So we have a new Brazil. Entrepreneurship is really possible. And now it's the paradise for all entrepreneurs. It's important to highlight that in this country today, with low interest rates and controlled inflation and so many reforms, today we don't need subsidies. Today, companies, they can get resources in the market at interest rates that needed to be subsidized in the past. With these reforms, we open the perspective of dropping subsidies very quickly in the country. This occurred in public banks. People would do an IPO or would issue debentures over 10 years. And the same thing for Caixa Econômica Federal. Instead of lending 10 million for a champion company, they deleveraged and they loaned 5 million to thousands of small businesses. So a revolution is occurring. The civil construction sector is booming. It's going to take a whole decade to really drain this. So this is why the tax reform is so important. And the Federative Pact bill, which you helped with, I put that clause of the Mansueto plan, which was to create the triggers for aid. So you have the triggers, and we help to restructure the finances. This is the Mansueto plan for states and cities. All of this was in the Federative Pact bill. This was divided into three: emergency, broad, and this was done for political reasons to facilitate the study in the House. And President Davi Alcolumbre asked us to divide this into three because this would make things easier in the Senate. We did so. This was an agreement amongst all of us. Davi Alcolumbre, Rodrigo Maia, and myself, we agreed to place the administrative in the House, the Federative Pact in the Senate, and advance with the tax in the mixed commission. And we were in a very virtuous moment when COVID arrived and deadlocked all of this. Then we had to create a war bill. And there's a protocol to face crises. Give us the emergency relief, but I can't without a war budget bill. And I always said that those setting the timing for the reforms and the political actions is Congress. We have the programs, but the timing is set by Congress. For example, we placed the Federative Pact bill, and when COVID arrived, the priority changed. And what was then at the forefront was the war budget bill. We spent these resources very well because the economy recovered in V, and we created jobs instead of losing jobs, and our programs are being awarded throughout the world. We preserved 11 million, and we created another 140,000. So these programs will be renewed, at least some of them, without a fiscal cost. We will announce novelties in a few days, and you will see that the programs worked very well. For example, the BEM, which was the emergency benefit, which preserved 11 million jobs. Instead of expecting someone to be laid off and then you receive 1,000 of welfare, it's much more intelligent to pay 500 for him not to be laid off. And This was the emergency relief bill. The company said that they were going to lay off, but then we said, look, we will give you 500 for you to keep the employee there. So I decreased the employment costs, and we were able to maintain jobs, and they spent less than laying off this. And so we worked the architecture that allowed this program to be extended, and now we are talking about the emergency relief bill. The original plan of the emergency relief, you know this, we had the war budget bill, and before this, we used the infraconstitutional space. We anticipated certain benefits like the 13th salary, etc., to protect the most fragile layers. We are waiting for Congress to return to start renewing some programs, and others that we can also put into practice. We are examining together with the president and have already anticipated these salary and welfare programs. And we also want to anticipate pension plans for some of the elderly. We are also discussing the budget. We already handed in the budget in March, April of last year, but it was deadlocked. It was there, but it was frozen there. Now we need to renew our budget. It was there to be approved. And you know that without the budget, you have two paths. One, to try to review the LDO, the budget, ask for extraordinary credit. So you have 4 or 5 such complex steps that it's much easier to use a war budget bill. And Congress already knows this. But if you approve a war budget bill, which is a blank check to spend outside of the environment or a context, of fiscal prudence, if you launch this outside of an environment, which was the environment of the Federative Pact bill, if you launch one thing without the other, you destabilize the market. Then the dollar destabilizes, inflation kicks in, interest rates kick up, and we really made efforts to hold the expenditures. And because we did this, people saw our seriousness to protect future generations. When we started the program, people were talking about a indebtedness GDP ratio of 100, but we closed at 80%. We're very cautious. Everything has a countermeasure. When we decentralized 60 million to states and cities, if you added this entire package, we had 450 billion, almost 150 billion between postponing indebtedness, the principal and the interests over the principal, and transferring fund by fund, and also transferring this to a sole fund of Social Security. When you add all of this up, it was almost 150 billion reais. We gave the resources to states and cities, but we insisted on this continuous fight. We had problems in the Senate and the House, and the government suggested that what I was asking for is that health money could not be transformed into salary increases. So a transitory expenditure could not become a permanent expenditure. And it was difficult to equate all this. I needed to ask the president to veto this. And later, he needed to articulate with governors and the House and the Senate to not cancel the veto, which they had already prepared to overrule. So it was very difficult to negotiate all of this. Brazil cannot face this risk again. So we need a guarantee that there will be a countermeasure. At that time, I was able to leave the resources of 150 billion go to states and cities, but I was able to revert this thanks to the president. And the contribution of the public machine was not to have restatements in 20 and 21. This represents 90 billion for states and cities and 40 billion for the federal government. So what we gave to cities and states, we removed in terms of salary restatements. This was incredible. The pandemic came to teach us a great lesson. Nothing defends the Brazilian population than good politics, and we did good politics. What was the balance of last year? We did not lack money for health. We were able to pass money to states and cities during the pandemic, and we did not restate salaries in 20 and 21. Sorry for interrupting you. It's also important to highlight that the agenda of the federal government went much beyond what states and cities requested. And the states are starting now with money in their accounts. The support of the federal government was substantial and very important. Yes, we were aware that this was important, but we asked for a countermeasure at every step. If you recall, when we gave money to states and cities, I asked to halt salary restatements. So we cannot distribute medals before the war is over. Imagine Germany bombarding London and Churchill instead of focusing on preparing D-Day and preparing tanks, etc., etc. Imagine if he was discussing with the subway people if there was going to be a strike to ask for salary hikes. So you can't have this, right? Our generation needs to be brave to assume this battle. And this was the great lesson that the pandemic taught us. There is no substitute for good politics. If the budget was indexed, we would not have money for health. We gave much more to health, but on the other hand, we de-indexed the salaries in order to be able to pay the crisis instead of pushing this to future generations. And if we hadn't done this, we could reach 100% of the GDP instead of 89%. So we kept this. This is very important, Minister. Based on what you're saying, there is a concern that you have since day one. In the first year of government, many governors came to us asking for help. They had a fiscal crisis in their state, and I'm not able to pay for my bills, and I need assistance from the federal government. And you always said the following: I want to help you in a structural way. I want to help you always. And the way I can do that is to have some mechanism of the state of calamity and something structured. And if the government assumes in a crisis, they can press a button and they can make an immediate fiscal adjustment to guarantee to the population that you will not lack access to education, health, etc. So before the crisis, you were thinking the following: there are several governors and mayors coming and talking about a crisis. They're not able to make a fiscal adjustment. So we need in this country a mechanism in which they can press a panic button and they have instruments to make the fiscal adjustment so that they don't lack money for essential functions. And this debate comes back today because it's important for you to contextualize. Of course, people will ask for some aid if the pandemic gets worse. Maybe an aid is necessary. But one thing that you always highlighted is the following: we need to seize these opportunities to improve our regulatory framework. And if there's a calamity in a state or a city or the federal government, we need automatic mechanisms for fiscal adjustment. Any aid, we don't want to postpone this bill. We don't want this bill to be paid by our grandchildren. Brazil is highly indebted. For this country to consolidate a scenario of low interest, low inflation, we need to make the fiscal adjustment. And then you're concerned that it's very legitimate. Everybody agrees that if we're going to provide any aid, we need to show how this aid will be paid by means of reforms. You always highlighted, and it's important for those watching to know this, Brazil has a tax burden similar to the UK, which is 700 billion above the average of Latin America. So we need to make a fiscal adjustment by eliminating expenses. This was never done. And this is why it's important for all of you to understand. Any short-term help needs to signal a structural reduction of the expenditure. So what is your idea here, Minister? Could you explain to us? Mansueto, that's perfect what you said. That's exactly it. This logic of a countermeasure is exactly when we gave the money to governors and we asked them to hold back on salary restatements. And this shows that we're very responsible. We're not going to leave aside the health expenditures, but we need to offset this by salary hikes. So we asked for this countermeasure. When the time came for a hike or to extend the emergency relief package, what did we ask in return? The administrative reform. So maybe I can spend a bit more this year if I am cutting back on future expenditures with administrative reforms. So it's exactly that logic what you mentioned. We need to have a countermeasure showing that we understand that this is a war, and this war requires an effort in terms of financing. So it's exactly what you said. And this brings us to the current scenario with the second great lesson of this crisis. The first lesson was that there's no substitute for good politics. When politics took over the public budget, we will suspend salary hikes for 2 years. This was very important. Now I'm going to extend the emergency relief package. Okay, so now I'm going to advance with the structural reforms, the administrative reform. Now, will we give more emergency relief? Yes, we can. Our original plan was that once the economy recovered in a V-shaped curve and the pandemic dropped, we said the following. And this decree was not from us, it was from Congress. They approved that the programs would expire on December 31st of 2020. Now we have a problem here. I cannot grant the emergency relief package because we have the golden rule, the expenditure limit. You could ask for extraordinary credit, but you need the argument of something that you cannot predict. We have the Supreme Court of Accounts. And if I'm going to do all this and negotiate, I'm going to take 34 days. But a war budget bill will take 24 hours. But a war budget bill, if it is not packaged or coupled or built into a public calamity clause within a federative bill where you have all the triggers. If we don't have this, this is a blank check that is endless. This could go for 3-4 months or 2-3 years, and we cannot depend on running around to the president of the House and then you go to the TCU. But the protocol's already set. And more interestingly, you don't need to press a button today because since we already locked salaries or froze salaries, whether through the emergency relief bill, I already did this last year. We were able to pass this last year, so everything is tied down. So we can gain 2-3 months of observation. We can give this emergency relief for 2-3 months, but we already have the protocol. So the market will understand the following. We gave 20 billion for the vaccines and for emergency relief, but there was a protocol for all future crises to hold for 1 year. Okay. When this lasted for 1 year, we stayed without a salary restatement for 1 or 2 years. So if we give the emergency relief package, we will freeze salaries for a longer time. So this is the war budget bill. So the President of the Republic, if he decides to restate salaries, he can do this, but he's not obligated to do this. And the same way in giving money to education, health, transportation, etc. If he wants to grant this, okay. Otherwise, if he doesn't want to, he will not, because we're in a war. It's as if we had locked the levels and then we closed the protocol doing the following. We had a protocol which was a federative pact bill saying that if a city is under difficulty, they can declare a state of emergency and they receive certain benefits and certain reliefs for a year or a year and a half. If we are able to approve this, no fiscal crisis. But our generation always lived fiscal crises. We can have hyperinflation, for example, snowballing, indebtedness. So this phenomenon of excessive expenditures is of our entire existence. Now imagine the following. If you have a protocol that locks the levels and returns the budgets to the political class, what happens? No fiscal crisis at any federal level will last more than a year. You can have inflation at 3-4%. Revenue will increase 8-9%. If expenditures are frozen, the revenue will grow 8% one year, the next year, and then you have no more deficit. I would even risk to say the following. If everyone goes home and sleeps for a year, the fiscal crisis is over. But you really have to put some effort to have a fiscal crisis last for 2-3 years. Because once you press the button, the crisis dissolves in 1 to 1.5 years. In the US, they do the shutdown, for example. We're not going to stop paying people. We're just not going to restate salaries. So we do this to guarantee that everything will be paid. Salaries, retirement funds. So whatever war comes forth, we're going to pay everything. And in 1.5 years, the crisis is over. More interestingly is that today, when they came to talk to us, and I'm moving from the past into the future now. Last week, we were just, you lived this entire battle that we went through, placing all the triggers, also the administrative reform. So what happened? We were able to maintain this logic. Okay? We have the emergency relief package. We gave the resources to states and cities, but the countermeasure were salaries. Now we are extending the emergency relief bill, but on the other hand, we place the administrative and structural reforms. Likewise, will we extend the emergency relief bill? Let's have a war budget bill, and let's place this as a clause of public calamity within the crisis protocol. So when you have a crisis in a city, it's the mayor. If it's in the state, it's the governor. And if it's the union, it's going to be the Ministry of Economy, the president. And we as the federal government, we don't need this. We have not restated our salaries for 3 years. So we're sure that we will fulfill our commitments without actuating this clause. But what if there's a crisis of everyone at the same time, which is the experience that we cross now? We already have the crisis protocol. First, you do the infraconstitutional measures. Then you have the war budget bill authorizing the state of emergency. And then you negotiate and deadlock these restatements. So nobody needs to negotiate anymore. There's already a protocol that has been created. Our first chats with the president, with the two presidents, we couldn't talk about this with those worried about elections. This was a known phenomenon here. So the reforms are timed by politics, and politics was deadlocked. It was restructuring itself. And this is very virtuous. Some people say, oh, they didn't do anything during the crisis. Much of the contrary, they did a lot. We approved in the Senate the autonomy of the central bank during the crisis. We approved the law of insolvency, the sanitation law. So we approved a lot of things amidst the crisis during the pandemic and also amidst the elections. The elections were taking place and we were making headway. So it would be an unfair criticism saying that we came to a halt. but there is the right of the change of office. And there's something very interesting that's occurring right now. It's natural. The center right won two elections, 2018, 2020. All center right parties, they increased their representativeness in, it wasn't in Congress, in municipal elections. In the spectrum of the representation of Brazilian democracy, patriotas, republicanos, PPP, DEM, all of these center-right parties increased their representation in city halls and legislative seats. So center-right won in 2018 elections at the state and federal level, and now in 2020 at a municipal level. So the center left, they lost a lot, and the center right, they increased their representativeness. So if Brazil is a democracy that is dynamic and vibrant, I always believe this. Isn't it reasonable that the agenda of the center right is based on an agreement with the center left, wherever? This would not be reasonable. So it was natural that now there is this fight for the leadership of Congress and the Senate. And it was natural to have somebody center right win these two seats. This is organic. This is natural. This election showed that the center right won this election at a federal and state level and renewed its victory at a municipal level in 2020. So it's natural that the control of the agenda in Congress is commanded by center right and not by a center left alliance. So all this war that was fought was natural, and now we are removing all the deadlocks here. Now we will have a series of things coming: railroads, oil, natural gas. So we will unlock the investment horizon. The central bank will help to unlock this, and we also have the agenda of investments. Privatizations were also deadlocked by this type of agreement, so the privatizations are forthcoming. Sometimes people say the minister announced this, but it didn't happen. But now I don't set any timeframes anymore. I didn't know that before. I would sit with the president of the House or the Senate, and then I would announce according to what they told me. But sometimes they would tell me something, and then it would take much longer than that. And before I used to say, in 14 weeks, we're going to change the scenario in the country. And then after 14 weeks, nothing happened. And after that, I would announce, okay, now we have 16 weeks. But then COVID came. And then people say, he promised and didn't deliver. But wait a minute, we had COVID here in the middle. And we were very successful in fighting COVID from an economic standpoint. There was no depression. Many people said that the economy would drop in an L-shaped curve. We would have deaths, etc. The diagnoses were very gruesome. And instead of unemployment dropping even more, no, we are recovering. So we are in a virtuous moment. You know that I always believed in these dynamics. For this final phase, we're almost reaching the end of our discussion. I would like you to highlight the future. Which reforms are the most urgent, and which are you going to prioritize for the Brazilian economy from now on? The response is in what we sent. Just look at our movements, and you know. Which reform was the most important? Social Security. This is the first one that we touched on. What is the second most important? The Federative Pact. So the triggers, the locks, the structure the new fiscal framework. So this is the second one that we sent to Congress. What was the third one that we sent immediately afterwards? The administrative reform, the central bank. So we were controlling expenditures with salaries, administrative reform. So we reduced 300 to 400 billion over the next 10 years. The privatizations and the de-investments, and this agenda did not move forward. So we failed in privatizations, and we were not able to make headway in the tax reform. So my federal income tax secretary left, and it's no coincidence that there was an agreement with the left to block the privatizations, and there was really a deadlock on some taxes. We will not increase his taxes. I would like to restate that. We will not increase taxes. We are liberal Democrats. We will not increase the tax burden. We can replace taxes. So if you want to decrease the payroll, you can do that, but maybe we'll create a new tax. So if you don't want to eliminate this tax, you're not going to increase taxes. So this is a program proposal of the president. He said, I'm not going to increase taxes. I prefer to accelerate privatizations, decrease the GDP. Now we were working at 1% GDP, then we went to 12%, but I'm not going to wait to have a surplus to deleverage the indebtedness. We will continue to leverage public banks, and we are making fundamental reserves. People want to buy dollars. Okay, come, you're welcome. We send a little bit of dollars, and we reduce public indebtedness once again. One thing is to have a dollar at 1.8 FX rate, and then you need 400 billion reserves. But if you have a dollar at 5, if you want to buy it at 5.56, this is not my exchange rate. This is the central bank that determines this. But we study this very deeply, and our plan considered this possibility. You know that. And people were afraid of rolling their indebtedness. Today, we are in a very comfortable condition. We have a current accounts indebtedness of 0, and if we move forward with your agenda, we will have dropping interest rates, and this will help people mortgage their homes. The dollar will plummet, and this will make fuel cheaper. People don't see this. If we advance in the tax reforms and the reforms that the government forwarded to Congress, we will have dropping interest rates and also inflation rates, and fuel prices will plummet, and this will become better for all of us. That's perfect, Mansueto, perfect. Better than having you here is having you on the other end of this, because you can evangelize. If we had 10 economists thinking like you, our interest rate would already be very low, because at least people would support the efforts that we're making. This was always the plan. And it's also important for you to mention the following. Paulo Guedes is an economist of the private sector. When he became the Minister of Finance, the first thing that you said, Mr. Minister, is that this world is very complex. The public sector has many competent people. I'm going to value these people. What people know is that for each special secretary that you brought from outside, you put as an assistant secretary a public servant with 20, 30 years of experience. Your direct assistants are public servants. You value public servants very much, and you valued everyone in the public servant area. And everyone that you brought from the private sector, you put matching public servants. We need to improve the HR of the state. The drop in public expenditures will be a natural consequence. Now, in the public sector, something happens that is very sad. You have many good employees. usually with 22, 23 years. Those employees at 34 years of age, they are at the end of their career. This is unfair with good public servants because they have no perspective. So the administrative reform, the purpose thereof is to improve the working of the public sector and the state careers. And the natural consequence of this is that when you have a more efficient state, they will save more with personnel. But it's not to cut public salaries, but to improve the career of public servants, those that show greater productivity. So public servants that will earn according to their productivity, of course, the state will save more. This is why the administrative reform is on the government agenda. And this is a way of valuing public servants. Perfect. So this is the priority. So we have the Federative Pact, which is a protocol for crisis, reinforced by the Public Calamity Clause, which is the war budget bill. Instead of being a blank check, now it is within the context of a new fiscal framework that is quite robust. We already made a sacrifice last year, and for us, there's no problem. This is a protocol for future crises, or if our crisis lasts another year or year and a half. If it lasts another 3-4 months, no problem, because we already made the sacrifice. We already locked salaries and all this back there. Now we are in a transition period between a public calamity state, which expired on December 31st, and another one will be a clause of a future event. During this interval, we will have the freedom to create a bridge, 3-4 months of emergency relief packaged by all this. If 3-4-6 months down the road the crisis continues, then you decree a new state of calamity. Otherwise, we just protect with this emergency relief for 3-4 months, waiting for the mass vaccination. So we will have two curves. One of mass vaccination increasing to protect the population and permit safe return to work. And as the protection layers went from 600 to 300, maybe we can drop it to 250, and then we land in the family welfare program, in other words, the Bolsa Familia program, and then we can have the green and yellow work permit, and we create the programs to maintain jobs. So there are many things that we're going to reveal over the next few days to show that we are in a virtuous cycle. The first chats with President Pacheco in the Senate and President Lira of the House were very constructive. They share this concern. The President of the Republic also shares the concern. Brazilians cannot stay behind. Health and economy, they walk hand in hand. They need to recover together. So let's mass vaccinate, and at the same time, let's create a layer of protection. And we extend this protection layer, but it needs to come within a protocol of the ongoing continuation. We do not lack resources in the present, but we need to protect future generations. We need to pay for the decisions we make and not just in debt in a snowball fashion upcoming generations. So we have the Federative Pact, and then we have this war budget bill. So both can be launched instantly, and Congress already knows both. The Federative Pact bill is there for 1 year, 3 months, and the war budget bill was approved in 48 hours. So Congress can approve this in 2-3 weeks. Everything is ready. The economy is protected, and at the same time, we launch this protection layer for the more vulnerable layers. And in the meantime, we do mass vaccination. And 3-4 months down the road, we rethink this. The pandemic is gone. We are successful. The economy is back on track. So Brazil takes off. And in the meantime, we approve the reforms in this order. First, the war budget bill. We renew the relief package. We have a consistent packaging. The independent central bank is already here Now we have the electric sector, ports, railroads, and also this year, but in a longer horizon, but it needs to be this year, the tax reform. Tax reform needs to occur this year as well. It just has a longer horizon because it's a bit more complex. It involves all the different states, and this will be a more difficult dialogue. And we have our parameters. For example, we will not increase taxes. We can place taxes on those who do not pay. Dividends, for example, do not pay. There are many exemptions of funds, etc. But we compensate this by decreasing taxes from companies. Our idea, for example, corporate taxes today, they can get up to 39%. The global average of corporate taxes is 40%, was 40%. Now it's at 20%. And 20% is really, really bad. We had a revolution here in Brazil because of 20% during colonial times. And we're not able to drop it to 20, but we went from 18% 40 years ago to 36%. So we doubled our tax burden. So our government would like to reduce this tax burden. We will not increase. So the private sector can be sure we will not hike taxes. If we increase taxes because we knock down 3-4 other taxes. So how are you going to reduce this indebtedness? He had a GDP of 3.4 and had a deficit of 2. We grew also, and we indebted 1. Was there a structural deficit or surplus? So it's a mistake to increase taxes amidst a depression. All economists know this. I like Keynes. Keynes is absolutely brilliant. But there's a time to use Keynes and there is a time not to use Keynes. During a depression, it's time to use Keynes. Some people want to zero indebtedness. And how can you increase taxes amidst deficit? I need to know what is the structural deficit. If the economy is balanced, if it grows at 3.5%, then we have low interest rates, strong FX rate. And if I have a structural surplus of 1.5, now I know how to recalibrate my taxes. But my premise is not to increase taxes. I'm going to wait until I have a surplus. No, we will divest in one side in assets that are not doing very well. We have 180 state-owned companies, and in the dependent companies, we generate 37 billion deficit. So we could have a family welfare program that would be really excellent. So we need to eliminate this deficit, and we need to create the mechanism for a more robust social program. So we're thinking of all of this. The order is the following. First, we want to create the layer of protection. We help with mass vaccination, employment security, and then this war budget bill. So I can only spend if I have an authorization. Therefore, the war budget bill is faster than extraordinary resources because you need to plea ineligibility. So this is going to take 40 days. This war budget offset by structural changes. Yeah. So it is under the format of a calamity clause, and it is embedded in the Federative Pact Bill. The triggers, they will only be actuated in future wars. So now it's an emergency relief bill. And this is a layer of generosity due to the legislative vacuum. So we launched this last protection layer, hoping to advance with mass vaccination. And only if we have a pandemic that lasts 1 year will we think of a trigger again. in a shorter term policy, this would be kind of related to minorities in the future. So we would look at the future and then we would see the public expenditure down the road. If you just have a blank check for you to spend, this will harm the Brazilian population. You think you will help, but in reality, you'll create unemployment, higher interest rates, more recession. So, under the name of helping, in reality, we're going to live the trauma that we had in the past. Many governments, they had great popular support, and they promised a paradise, but they broke Brazil and launched Brazil into disgrace. And the economy went in the opposite direction. And this other side wants to create a sustainable future for Brazil. So this is the virtue of democracy. We need to have social sensitivity, know of the effects, and a second important lesson of the crisis. The first was the essence of a good politics. Since this is much above what you always mentioned, Brazil is managed by a software. The political class is not able to manage this. They're not capable of managing this because the budget is already stamped and they're not able to manage. The public budget is out of their control and they need to once again assume control of this. So this is the first great lesson. The second great lesson, if you want to do away with misery, we have 30 years of social problems. We have public funds. We have income transfer. But the greatest reduction of poverty was done in these months. Why? Because we used the basic principle of money being delivered immediately to the poor. The elite thinks that they know what to do. So you have to create a public bank that will help doing the investments that will generate the income for the poorer class. No, if you want to solve poverty issues, hand them directly the money. They will decide what to do, which is something that is in the classic manuals of Milton Friedman. He defended this, and PT mentioned this in the form of Bolsa Família, the family welfare program. With 10 million reais, they were able to affect a very large parcel of the population, and they were reelected. And now we used exactly the same conception of directly transferring wealth to the poverty-stricken population. But we need to do this in a sustainable way. So what is ahead of us is responsibility, commitment towards fiscal responsibility, but with social sensitivity. We need the vaccine. We need a protection layer because the disease is here. We will have a higher basic income in the future, but all with good fiscal fundamentals. Otherwise, we will lose track of things, as has happened. Great intentions resulted in corruption, misery, and some countries went much beyond that, which is the case of Venezuela, and also Argentina is headed in the same direction. And the disease is really rampant, so we need to have this commitment, and we have this responsibility, and we need to be sensitized, socially speaking. So this is the urgency. Tax is a bit down the road. So this is why it hasn't been done yet. What we had there had an increase of taxes, which is what happened in São Paulo. And everybody was saying that this is good politics. No, this is not good politics. You cannot increase taxes. You need to control your spending. You need the economy to come back to a balance. You see what your structural deficit is. If it's a social democratic, they will increase taxes. If it's a liberal, you will cut back on taxes. So the response as to the plan is always the same. Privatize, open the economy, recover the economy, zero indebtedness by controlling debts, and then the economy starts taking off, zero deficit, privatizations, tax reform, simplifying and reducing taxes. And the measures are there. Many of them are already there. And they would say, well, where are the measures? You produce the measures, so they're in there. Now is the political opportunity. Now it is pressing, and we have the crisis protocol. So you combine both in 20, 30 days. You're taking off once again, right? We could stay another 2 hours, Minister, chatting here. It's always very exciting to talk to you. We have a country with a very great potential. People forget that Brazil has very strong agriculture and has an industrial sector that is very strong. It is a diversified country, so it doesn't depend on one or two sectors. We have a very strong oil and gas sector. So with the reforms, we have everything to grow very quickly. And then we'll have better fiscal indicators. We'll levy more taxes. And by cutting back on expenses, we will grow even faster. And if we can cross this ocean of the tax reform, we will have lower interest rates. And this will influence on mortgaging, which will become cheaper. And a cheaper dollar based on fundamentals in the private sector. Each economist does a different calculation. But if we move forward in this list of reforms that you mentioned, probably the dollar will drop below 5. So a cheaper dollar means cheaper fuel in a sustainable fashion. And a dollar at 5, 4.90, 4.80 is still very good for exports. So this country that is growing much below what it could, considering our productive structure, if we make headway in these reforms that you mentioned, everyone wins. Everyone needs to understand and needs to do their part. So on behalf of BTG Pactual, I would like to thank you for your availability after such a long day. Nobody knows how tough the minister's day. It's 12 hours of meeting every day. And thank you so much for participating here and explaining all the challenges and the governmental plans. And on behalf of BTG Pactual, we support this modernization agenda. It's very important to fight against inequality and poverty. So we need to improve the allocation of public resources and expand programs that have greater effect. And we need to grow in a consistent fashion. I always like to recall the example of two developed countries, the UK and the US. After World War II, they spent 60 years growing in a very consistent way without an economic miracle. These two countries, they didn't have years of 6-7% of growth, but over 60 years they grew in a very consistent way. With your agenda of structural reforms, you have a proposal of growing the country in a consistent way. So it would not be good to increase indebtedness and public spending. No, you propose to make the necessary reforms to put the country back on track to grow. So I would like to thank you, congratulate you for your work. It's very difficult. And we are here to support you in such important reforms that you have set forth for the country. Thank you very much, Mansueto. You are a great Brazilian. You spent a year and a half helping us and setting the roadmap. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. And you continue to help us with this clarity in exposing and reinforcing our attempt of making the reforms of the country. As you mentioned, these reforms over the next 60 to 90 days, with a new parliament support, this may leverage this transformational process, and it opens the horizon for investments. With low interest rates, we have civil construction, also the FX rate, maybe at 4.90, 4.50, cheaper food, cheaper fuel. And on the same hand, you have the ports, electric sector, railroads plummeting. Brazil today is the greatest border, and we are desynchronized. And we are doing the reforms and will resume growth. They are starting to enter a different cycle. Some are starting to increase abroad, and some of them had a long deflation period. Now they're starting to see inflation kick in, and they need to seek a direction. And they're going to seek production. And we're also improving our ranking as to the facility of doing business. So there are many things that we're doing, as you well know, that is not published by the great media. We are simplifying, removing bureaucracy, and the combination of 5 ministries, the reduction of 5 ministries. We were reforming the Social Security and the Federative Pact, and we concentrated ministries. We reduced expenditures from 15 to 10 billion. You are at BTG, you are restructuring the company. You know how difficult this is to join 5 ministries and cut expenditures by 30%. That's very tough. We are working on the inside. We are simplifying our processes. And this is a principle that the central bank is already using. They're doing this both on the outside and inside. And you combine this knowledge and this excellence of the elite group with the people coming from abroad who want to make changes and innovate. So we will trail along these steps. We will open the economy. We will start mass vaccination. And we will also talk to the Mercosur. We want to reconfigure some things about common tariffs, technology goods, machinery goods, etc. We will invest more. And for each invested real, we want to be able to buy more machinery than before. So we will gradually open. So in the first year, we will trail 10%, the second year, 20%, and so on and so forth. And until then, the tax reform will already have been implemented. You know the trail to prosperity. And I invite you to join forces with us. I'm sure this will work out. We will get there. Thank you very much. Let's move on. And I wish all of you the best and wonderful investments to all of you. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister.